The Book of Ezra, Chapter 2. Here is a list of the people of the province who had been exiled, carried off to Bavel by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Bavel, but who later returned from exile and went up to Jerusalem and Yehuda, each to his own city. They went with Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reeliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, Baanah, and Baanah. The number of men from the people of Israel: descendants of Parosh, 2,172. Descendants of Shephatiah, 372. Descendants of Arach, 775. Descendants of Pachat Moav, from the descendants of Yeshua and Joav, 2,812. Descendants of Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Zatu, 945. Descendants of Zakai, 760. Descendants of Bani, 642. Descendants of Bavai, 623. Descendants of Azgad, 1,222. Descendants of Adonikam, 666. Descendants of Bigvai, 2,056. Descendants of Adin, 454. Descendants of Ater of Yehizkiah, 98. Descendants of Betzai, 323. Descendants of Yorah, 112. Descendants of Hashum, 223. Descendants of Gibar, 95. Descendants of Beet Lechem, 123. People of Netophah, 56. People of Anatot, 128. Descendants of Azmavet, 42. Descendants of Kiryat Arim, Kaphirah, and Beerot, 743. Descendants of Ramah and Giva, 621. People of Mikmas, 223. Or 122, sorry. Verse 28. People of Beatel and Ai, 223. Descendants of Navo, 52. Descendants of Magbish, 156. Descendants of the other Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Harim, 320. Descendants of Lod, Hadid, and Ono, 725. Descendants of Jericho, 345. Descendants of Sana'a, 3,630. The Kohanim, descendants of Yedaiah, of the house of Yeshua, 973. Descendants of Immer, 1,054. Descendants of Pashkur, 1,247. Descendants of Harim, 1,017. The Levaim, descendants of Yeshua and Kadmiel, of the descendants of Hodaviah, 74. The singers, descendants of Asaph, 128. The descendants of the gatekeepers, descendants of Shallum, descendants of Ater, descendants of Talmon, descendants of Akuv, descendants of Hatita, descendants of Shovai, in all 139. The temple servants, descendants of Tzikah, descendants of Hasufa, descendants of Tabaot, descendants of Kiros, descendants of Siaha, descendants of Padon, descendants of Lavana, descendants of Hagava, descendants of Akuv, descendants of Hagav, descendants of Salmai, descendants of Hanan, descendants of Gedel, descendants of Gachar, descendants of Reaiah, descendants of Retzin, descendants of Nakoda, descendants of Gazam, descendants of Uzzah, descendants of Paseach, descendants of Bisai, descendants of Asna, descendants of Miunim, descendants of Nafusim, descendants of Bakbuk, descendants of Hakufa, descendants of Harhur, descendants of Batslut, descendants of Makhida, descendants of Harsha, descendants of Barkos, descendants of Sisra, descendants of Temach, descendants of Natsiach, and descendants of Hatifa. The descendants of Shlomo's servants, descendants of Sotai, descendants of Hasso-Pheret, descendants of Peruda, descendants of Ya'ala, descendants of Darkan, descendants of Gedel, descendants of Shaphatia, descendants of Hatil, descendants of Pokeret Hatzvayim, and descendants of Ami. All the temple servants and the descendants of Shlomo's servants numbered 392. The following went up from Tel Melach, Tel Harsha, Karuv, Adan, and Emer. But they could not state which father's clan they or their children belonged to, so it was not clear whether they were from Israel. Descendants of Delaiah, descendants of Taviah, and descendants of Nakoda, 652. And of the descendants of the Kohanim, descendants of Haviah, descendants of Hakots, and descendants of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai the Giladi, and was named after them. These tried to locate their genealogical records, but they weren't found. Therefore they were considered defiled and were not allowed to serve as Kohanim. The Tirshata told them not to eat any of the especially holy food until a Kohen appeared who could consult the Urim and Tumim. The entire assembly numbered 42,360, not including their male and female slaves, of whom there were 7,337. They also had 200 male and female singers. Their horses numbered 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, and their donkeys 6,720. Some of the heads of fathers' clans, when they came to the house of Adonai in Yerushalayim, made voluntary offerings for rebuilding the house of God on its site. According to their means, they gave into the treasury for the work 61,000 gold dark monim, about 2/3 of a ton, 5,000 manim of silver, just over 3 tons, and 100 tunics for the Kohanim. So the Kohanim, the Levaim, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants lived in their towns, and all Israel in their towns. End of Ezra, chapter 2.